The smell hit first lamp oil and eucalyptus bark, sharp enough to wake the dead. Then came the screaming. This is the story of how one Aboriginal woman turned a garrison barracks into a crematorium, and why the ashes held a secret that would haunt her until her final breath. Sydney Cove, 1791. The settlement clung to the harbor like a scab on wounded land. All raw, timber and canvas tents where convict labor built England's newest dumping ground. The barracks sat on the western ridge, weathered sandstone blocks, mortared with crushed shell and prisoner sweat, housing 42 soldiers who kept order with musket and lash. At night, whale oil lamps cast shadows that danced like demons across walls that had heard too many screams to count. Marinya moved through the settlement's edges, the way smoke moves through trees, present but untouchable. The soldiers called her Mary when they bothered to call her anything at all, because English tongues couldn't wrap around the name her mother had given her beneath the she-oak trees. She was maybe 25 years old, though no one kept records of such things for her people. Her sisters had disappeared 3 months earlier. Nadira and Korana, taken in daylight while gathering fish from the mudflats. The soldiers claimed they'd gone willingly to work in the garrison kitchens. The bruises on their faces when Marinya glimpsed them through the barracks windows told different stories. Before we go deeper into this colonial nightmare, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in colonial archives for over 2 centuries. The plan began forming the night she heard Nadira singing through the barracks window. Not the happy songs from before, but the mourning wail their grandmother had taught them for when the world breaks beyond repair. Marinya understood then that some chains don't break with pleading or prayer. They break with fire. She spent 2 weeks gathering what she needed. Nightshade grew wild near the creek where the convicts dumped their waste. The settlers called it deadly nightshade and knew enough to avoid it, but they didn't know the old ways of preparation, how to concentrate the poison until a few drops could stop a heart, how to mask the bitter taste with honey stolen from native beehives. The garrison cooks had started accepting food from the Aboriginal camp, a peace offering, they thought, evidence of the natives' gradual civilization. Marinya encouraged this belief, bringing fish wrapped in paper bark, yams roasted in the traditional way, always smiling, always bowing her head in deference. Trust, she learned, was just another weapon. On the night of March 7th, 1791, she brought them rum. The soldiers appreciated alcohol more than food, especially rum flavored with wild honey, and something else they couldn't quite identify, a slight bitterness that disappeared after the 3rd swallow. The nightshade worked slowly, carefully measured to cause drowsiness first, confusion second, paralysis third. By midnight, 40 men lay in their bunks in various states of stupor, their weapons stacked uselessly against walls they could no longer reach. Marinya walked through the barracks like a ghost cataloging the condemned. Most were unconscious. A few watched her with drugged confusion, unable to form words or lift their hands. She found her sisters in the back room where the officers kept their personal servants. Nadira was already dead. Her body showed why. Korana barely breathed, her eyes tracking Marinya with animal recognition but no human understanding left behind them. What would you do, standing in that room? Would you try to save the one who remained? Or would you finish what you'd started? The lamp oil was stored in barrels by the southern wall, meant for lighting but useful for so much more. Marinya worked methodically, splashing it across bunks and wooden support beams, across the threshold where the door would trap anyone who woke in time to panic. She left Korana. Where she lay there was no saving her now, and movement would mean exposure. Some mercies come disguised as abandonment. She struck the flint at 12 minutes past midnight, and the barracks became a furnace. The flames caught faster than she'd anticipated, racing across oil-soaked wood with hungry purpose. Men woke screaming, stumbling into walls and each other, their coordination destroyed by poison and panic. A few made it to windows only to find them barred from outside the garrison's own security measures becoming their tomb. Marinya stood in the shadow of the she-oak trees and watched the fire paint the night sky orange, listening to the sounds that would follow her into every dream for the rest of her life. But fire reveals what darkness hides, and as the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and timber, Marinya saw something that stopped her heart mid-beat. A child's body in the doorway, too small to be a soldier, too light-skinned to be full-blood Aboriginal. The flames hadn't yet reached this section, and in the firelight, she recognized the face, her own eyes, her own nose, wrapped in the pale skin of her enemy's blood. The child she'd hidden with her aunt upriver, the pregnancy she'd concealed until it was too late to hide, the consequence of a night 6 years ago when refusal hadn't been an option and Captain Morrison had made his authority abundantly clear. She'd killed her own son along with his father. The fire burned until dawn, and by the time the settlement's bucket brigade arrived, nothing remained but smoking stone and the smell of cooked meat that would linger in the cove for weeks. 42 soldiers dead, they'd report, plus 2 Aboriginal servants who'd been sleeping in the back rooms. They never mentioned the child half-caste children were inconvenient truths better left unrecorded. But what they didn't know was that one woman still stood in the tree line, covered in ash and comprehension, learning that revenge and justice are not synonyms, and that some fires consume everything, including the parts of yourself you'd forgotten existed. The real horror wasn't the burning, it was what came after. Smoke still rose from the ruins when Governor Phillip convened his emergency council at 8 o'clock that morning. The colony's security had just burned alive, and someone would answer for it. Sydney Cove's 200 souls gathered in clusters around the smoldering barracks. Convicts whispered behind their hands. Officers shouted contradictory orders, and the Aboriginal people who lived on the settlement's margins watched with faces carved from stone. The March heat made the ash smell worse, mixing with harbor salt and rotting seaweed to create a stench that coated the back of your throat like guilt. Lieutenant Dawes, the colony's chief engineer, walked a perimeter with a measuring chain, trying to reconstruct what mathematics and malice had conspired to create this catastrophe. Marinya sat with the other Aboriginal women near the tank stream, grinding seeds with a stone as if the world hadn't ended overnight. Her hands moved steadily. Grind, sweep, grind the rhythm older than the settlement, older than English law, older than the concept of murder as crime rather than necessity. The other women gave her space, without being obvious about it. They knew, not the details perhaps, but the shape of what had happened, the why of it. Knowledge moved through their community like water through sand, invisible but thorough. From the military log, March 8th, 1791. Inspection of Barracks ruins reveals no evidence of external attack. Fire appears to have started simultaneously in multiple locations. Survivors: none. Cause: under investigation. Captain Tench, second in command of the Marine garrison, stood at the ruin's edge and understood immediately what the log would never record. You didn't get simultaneous ignition points from accident or even from a single arsonist working in panic. This had been planned with the patience of someone who'd learned to wait, who'd watched and studied and chosen the exact moment when 42 men would be too compromised to save themselves. He looked toward the Aboriginal camp and saw Marinya's steady grinding, saw the way the other women had positioned themselves, not close enough to seem protective, not far enough to suggest abandonment. He said nothing. What made a man stay silent when he knew the truth? Was it guilt recognition that the garrison had earned this ending? Was it pragmatism understanding that accusing without proof would start a war the colony couldn't win? Or was it something simpler? The exhaustion of maintaining civilization's pretense in a place where civilization had arrived, wearing chains and carrying whips. The investigation lasted 3 days and discovered exactly what it was permitted to discover. The fire had started from knocked-over lamps, multiple lamps, because soldiers were careless with flame. The doors had been barred from inside because the men feared Aboriginal attack at night. The 2 native women found dead in the back rooms had been trapped like everyone else, innocent victims of tragic accident. Case closed, bodies buried, new barracks already being planned on higher ground. But some truths refuse burial. Private Coleman had been on patrol that night, walking the northern perimeter when the fire started. His testimony, given quietly to Captain Tench and never written down, told a different story. He'd seen a woman he wouldn't say, which woman, standing near the barracks' southern wall just before midnight. She'd been carrying something, maybe barrels, maybe nothing. The moonlight played tricks. When the flames erupted, she hadn't run toward the fire to help or away from it in fear. She'd stood motionless, watching, until a section of roof collapsed and she'd made a sound Coleman couldn't quite describe. Not celebration, not grief. Something older than English had words for. "Did you report this?" Tench asked. "What would I report, sir? That a native woman stood on open ground? That she made a noise when 40 men burned? Half the settlement was standing there by the end." Tench dismissed him without another word. The child's body was discovered on March 10th by convict workers clearing debris. He was maybe 5 or 6 years old. Impossible to tell exactly after the fire's work. What identified him as mixed blood was the hair not quite kinky, not quite straight, and the facial structure that suggested 2 worlds colliding in one small skull. No one knew his name. No one admitted to knowing he existed. Captain Morrison, who might have recognized his own features in the dead boy's face, was ash and bone fragments, beyond questioning. They buried the child in the unmarked section where the colony disposed of inconveniences, stillborn infants, executed convicts, problems without solutions. Marinya watched from a distance, grinding seeds, her hands never stopping their ancient rhythm. Grief disguised as routine. That night, she walked to the burial ground alone. The settlements, to pigs, had already started rooting in the fresh earth. Nothing stayed buried long in Sydney Cove's hungry soil. She didn't cry. The Eora people had songs for mourning, rituals for sending spirits home. But she'd broken something when she lit that fire. The old ways didn't account for mothers who killed their own children, even accidentally, even as collateral in righteous vengeance. She stood in the darkness and felt herself floating somewhere between 2 worlds, belonging fully to neither, welcomed completely by none. From Marinya's perspective, though, we only have fragments passed down through oral tradition. The child had been hidden upriver with her mother's sister, meant to be raised away from the settlement's poisonous influence. But children wander, curious and unknowing. He must have followed one of the soldiers back to the garrison, must have been sleeping in some corner when the poison and fire did their work. She'd never even given him a proper name, afraid that naming him would make him real, make him a claim the soldiers could use to bind her more tightly to their service. Now he was ash without identity, grief without witness. The colony's women, both convict and free, began avoiding the Aboriginal camp. Some claimed they'd seen spirits near the burned barracks, pale shapes that wailed in languages older than Latin. Others reported dreams where fire consumed everything they touched, where their own children burned while they stood paralyzed. Superstition or guilt by proxy, the effect was the same, a widening circle of empty space around Marinya and her people. Only old Margaret Dawson, a transported thief from London's rookeries, broke the silence. She brought Marinya bread one morning, set it down without a word, and left. That evening, Marinya returned the basket with fresh fish. Nothing was said. Some treaties exist below language, but the question that haunted the settlement's quiet moments was this: how many others were watching and waiting, learning from Marinya's example? How many servants smiled while planning? How many cooks measured ingredients with murder in their hearts? Governor Phillip addressed this fear in a memo that was read aloud to both Marines and convicts, but never to the Aboriginal people it discussed. The native population must be engaged with diplomacy and cautious friendship. Any measures that might inspire collective retaliation are hereby forbidden. What he meant was simpler. We're outnumbered, and we just learned they can burn us while we sleep. The power balance had shifted, invisible but absolute, and everyone in Sydney Cove understood that civilization's edge was thinner than they'd imagined. Just one woman with poison and patience away from collapse. Marinya continued grinding seeds, while the colony rebuilt its garrison with thicker walls and more guards. Not understanding that walls and guards were useless against someone who'd already lost everything, who'd already killed the one piece of her future she tried to protect. The real fire was inside her now, and it would burn for 20 more years before someone finally found a way to put it out. Governor Arthur Phillip stood at his desk reviewing casualty reports, while his hands trembled with something that wasn't quite rage. 42 trained Marines dead, and he couldn't even punish the woman responsible. His office overlooked the harbor where 3 transport ships sat at anchor, their holds still packed with convicts waiting to disembark into a colony that had just proven its vulnerability. The room smelled of salt-damp paper, and the brandy Philip had been drinking since dawn. Medicinal doses for medicinal problems, he told himself. Through the window, he could see Aboriginal people fishing from their bark canoes with the same casual ease they'd shown for millennia, utterly unbothered by the smoking ruins visible from every angle of the cove. The political mathematics was brutal and simple. The colony held roughly 200 Europeans, convicts, Marines, and officers combined. The Aboriginal population within a day's walk numbered in the thousands, maybe tens of thousands. They knew every water source, every game trail, every place where the land itself could kill unwary foreigners. A war would end with European skulls decorating spear points, and London was 18 months away by ship. From Governor Phillip's private correspondence, March 15, 1791. I am convinced the fire was deliberate. I am equally convinced that prosecution would ignite a conflict we cannot win. The perpetrator walks freely among us, and we must pretend not to know. Captain Tench presented his official report that afternoon. The 2 men stood in Philip's office, speaking truths that would never reach paper. Outside, convict work gangs hammered new timber for the replacement barracks, each blow echoing across the cove like a countdown to the colony's next disaster. You know it was her, Tench said. Not a question. I know nothing that can be proven in any court that matters. Philip poured 2 glasses of brandy without asking if Tench wanted one. What I know is that 2 Aboriginal women were taken into garrison service against their will. What I know is that Captain Morrison had appetites he didn't control. What I know is that fires don't start themselves in 6 places simultaneously. So we do nothing? We do something far more difficult than punishment. We learn. The colony's approach to the Aboriginal people shifted over the following weeks, with the subtlety of a glacier and the calculation of a merchant weighing gold. No more forced service in the garrison. No more casual abductions of women from the fishing grounds. Officers were instructed to maintain respectful distance, to offer payment for services, to understand that hospitality was a negotiation, not a right conferred by British sovereignty. Some called it enlightened governance. Others recognized it as fear dressed in diplomatic clothing. But policy changes in the governor's office didn't erase what had happened in soldiers' hearts. The replacement Marines who arrived on the next transport heard the story within hours of landing, how Native Mary had burned their predecessors alive, how she walked freely through the settlement, how British justice had bent its knee to colonial pragmatism. They watched her, with the particular hatred reserved for enemies you're forbidden to touch. Private James Wilcox, age 19, newly arrived from Portsmouth, made his intentions clear to anyone who'd listen. That black witch murdered 40 good men. Someone ought to do something about it. Regulations be damned. Would you stand silent while a murderer walked free? Or would you take justice into your own hands? Consequences and context be damned. Marinya felt the weight of their stares, like physical pressure. She'd become famous in the worst way. A symbol, a warning, a story told to new arrivals about colonial dangers and native treachery. The specifics got lost in retelling. Few versions mentioned her sisters, or the child, or the circumstances that had led a woman to choose fire over submission. History was already simplifying her into something digestible. The savage who couldn't be trusted. The killer hiding behind a woman's face. She began spending more time away from the settlement, ranging farther into the bush where European boots rarely trod. The land welcomed her back, like a mother accepting a prodigal daughter. She knew every plant, every seasonal change, every pattern of animal movement. Out here, she wasn't Mary the murderer or Marinya the mourner. She was simply Aora, belonging to country in ways the settlers, with their fences and flags, would never comprehend. But isolation offered no immunity from memory. On April 2nd, 1791, she returned to the settlement to find it transformed by fear's architecture. The new barracks featured multiple exits, external locks on windows, and a night watch system that kept 2 men awake and armed at all times. The kitchens had been moved to a separate building where food preparation happened under constant supervision. Aboriginal people were no longer permitted inside any military structure without 3 witnesses present. One woman with poison and fire had reshaped colonial policy more effectively than any diplomatic negotiation. Lieutenant Dawes, who spent more time studying the Aboriginal people than subjugating them, sought Marinya out that evening. He'd been learning her language slowly, awkwardly, but with genuine effort that set him apart from other officers. They met near the tank stream, where she still came to grind seeds, where the water's sound provided cover for conversations others shouldn't hear. "The new Marines are planning something," he said in broken Aora, supplemented with English when his vocabulary failed. "Private Wilcox. Others. They talk about justice." Marinya didn't look up from her grinding stone. "Your justice or mine? The kind that ends with you dead." He paused, searching for words. "Governor can't protect you if you're killed away from the settlement. Accident in the bush. Nobody witness." She'd expected this. Violence begets violence in cycles that spiral outward until everyone's covered in blood or ash. The surprise was Dawes warning her. This officer who'd arrived on the same ships as the men she'd murdered, who should by all logic want her punished rather than protected. "Why tell me?" she asked. "Because what Morrison did to your sisters was wrong. Because that child in the fire." He stopped, looked away. "Because maybe British civilization isn't always civilized. Some cracks in colonial certainty run deeper than others." That night, Marinya slept with a sharpened stick beside her, listening to every sound the darkness carried. The Aora had their own justice systems, their own ways of handling those who broke tribal law. But what law covered this situation? What precedent addressed a woman who'd killed her oppressors and accidentally murdered her own child in the process? The old people had no answers, because this situation was new colonization, created moral territories where traditional wisdom couldn't reach. 3 days later, Private Wilcox disappeared during a patrol. His body was found a week after that, decomposing in the bush with a spear through his chest. The Aboriginal people claimed no knowledge. The Marines suspected everything. Governor Phillip wrote another memo about maintaining diplomatic relations while privately understanding that an eye for an eye had become the colony's actual governing principle. Marinya had been nowhere near Wilcox when he died. She had witnesses, alibis, proof of presence elsewhere, but everyone knew guilt wasn't personal anymore. It was collective, tribal, a shared responsibility that made individuals interchangeable in the mathematics of revenge. The settlement had become a powder keg, where every spark threatened explosion, and the woman who'd lit the first match sat grinding seeds by the stream, watching her people and the Europeans circle each other like animals, uncertain whether to fight or flee. But the real question nobody asked was this: how long could this balance hold before someone native or European decided that peace cost more than war? The answer was closer than anyone imagined, and it would arrive wearing Marinya's face but carrying motivations even she didn't fully understand. Bennelong stood on the ridgeline above Sydney Cove, watching smoke from cooking fires mix with harbor mist. He'd seen everything: the burning, the burial, the careful dance of lies that followed. The eucalyptus forest behind him breathed with cicada song and the rustle of unseen wallabies moving through undergrowth thick as secrets. From this vantage, the entire settlement spread below like a child's toy miniature buildings, miniature people, miniature ambitions, trying to root themselves in soil that had never asked for them. Bennelong had been living between worlds for 2 years now, speaking English well enough to translate, wearing European clothes when it suited him, sleeping in the governor's house when the mood struck. The British called him their bridge to the native population. His own people called him something less flattering. He'd known about Marinya's plan 3 days before the fire. Not the details, she'd been too careful for that, but the shape of it, the inevitability. You couldn't steal 2 women from the mudflats and expect their sister to grind seeds forever, swallowing rage until it dissolved into submission. He'd seen the nightshade collecting, noticed how she'd started bringing gifts to the garrison with a smile that never reached her eyes. He could have warned someone. Governor Philip trusted his counsel, would have listened if Bennelong had spoken. He'd chosen silence. From Bennelong's later testimony to missionary Reverend Threlkeld, recorded 1803, the white men took what wasn't offered. My people had laws for such things, death laws. The fire was law, just not their law. The question that haunted the settlement also haunted Bennelong, but from a different angle. Europeans asked, how could she murder so many? He asked, how could she have done anything else? The British brought their concepts of justice and civilization, their courts and gallows and ordered punishment, but they'd suspended those very systems when convenient, when Aboriginal women needed protecting, when Aboriginal land needed taking. You couldn't selectively apply civilization and then act shocked when people rejected it entirely. Still, the child bothered him. Bennelong had seen the small body in the aftermath, had recognized what everyone else tried to ignore: the mixed blood, the features that told stories of violence disguised as desire. He'd known Morrison, had watched how the captain looked at Aboriginal women with the particular hunger of men who believed their uniforms granted them access to any body they wanted. The child was proof that sometimes violence produced consequences that outlived the original sin. What justice existed for a woman who'd killed her rapist and accidentally murdered the son that rape had created? The settlement below was changing in ways both visible and subtle. The new barracks sat squat and defensive, designed more to resist fire than house men comfortably. Marines patrolled in pairs now, never alone, hands always near their weapons. The Aboriginal people who'd previously moved freely through the settlement's edges now kept greater distance, as if the burning had drawn a line everyone could see but nobody acknowledged. Bennelong descended the ridge as afternoon shadows lengthened, taking paths only Aora feet knew. He found Marinya where he'd expected, at the old grinding rocks near the southern creek, working with that mechanical rhythm that spoke of minds gone elsewhere. She didn't look up when he approached. Recognition didn't require eye contact when you'd known someone since childhood. "They're planning to kill you," he said in their language, dispensing with greetings. "The new Marines. Governor Philip can't stop it if it happens away from witnesses." "I know." Her hands never paused. "Lieutenant Dawes already warned me. And I've already died once. The woman I was burned in that barracks with her son." This, she gestured at herself, at the mechanical grinding, at the mask she wore in place of a face. "This is just smoke that hasn't dispersed yet." Bennelong had no response to that. Depression wasn't a word either culture had, but both understood the condition, the soul sickness that came when grief exceeded the body's capacity to process it. He'd seen it in warriors who'd lost too many battles, in women who'd buried too many children, in anyone who'd crossed thresholds that didn't allow return passage. The old people say you should go inland, he offered, away from the settlement. Let time scatter the anger. The old people also say women who kill their own children belong to neither the living nor the dead. She finally looked up, and her eyes held nothing a living person should carry. I'm already in exile, Benelong. Geography won't change that. He wanted to argue, but couldn't. The Aora had complex laws about children, about bloodshed, about the boundaries between justified vengeance and murder that stained your spirit beyond cleansing. Marinya had crossed multiple boundaries simultaneously, creating a moral tangle that even the elders couldn't fully unravel. She was victim and perpetrator, righteous and damned, deserving of both protection and punishment. The twilight brought mosquitoes and the sound of evening birds settling. Down in the settlement, lamps were being lit, tiny stars of human defiance against the vast darkness of a continent that didn't want them. Benelong watched Marinya grind seeds that nobody would eat, performing work that had lost all purpose, except as rhythm to count the hours between sunrise and sleep. What happens now? He asked. Now, I wait. Either the Marines kill me, or the grief does, or time passes until I'm just another story old women tell to teach young ones about the cost of fighting back. She paused, stone scraping against stone. What would you have done, Benelong, if they'd taken your sisters? He had no honest answer that didn't make him complicit in either her burning or her grief. That night, several things happened simultaneously across Sydney Cove. Private Daniel Fletcher and Private Thomas Wade, both friends of the deceased Wilcox, left the settlement at dusk, claiming they were checking fishing lines. They didn't return until near midnight, their clothes torn and faces scratched as if they'd pushed through heavy bush. They reported seeing Aboriginal people in the forest, but nothing specific, nothing actionable. Marinya was grinding seeds by the creek until someone saw her walking back to the Aboriginal camp well after dark. She moved differently, slower, favoring her left side, as if something had hurt her or she'd hurt something else. And Benelong sat in Governor Phillip's house drinking rum that burned his throat the same way lies burned his conscience, saying nothing about anything while the governor complained about the impossibility of maintaining order in a colony where everyone had secrets and nobody had clean hands. The truth about that evening wouldn't emerge for 3 more days, when Wade started complaining of stomach pains that doctors initially attributed to bad fish. By the time they realized it was poison, not nightshade this time, but something else, something slower he'd already told his messmates about trying to catch the Aboriginal woman alone, about how she'd fought like a cornered animal, about how Fletcher had taken a stone to the head that left him unconscious for 20 minutes. Wade died on April 20th, 1791, his insides dissolving while doctors argued about treatment. Fletcher recovered from his head wound, but never spoke again. Something had broken in his brain that no surgery could fix. The official record called it food poisoning. Everyone else understood it as the latest exchange in a war that had no formal declaration, no clear battle lines, just body counts that accumulated on both sides, while authorities pretended civilization still governed behavior. Marinya continued grinding seeds by the creek, her left arm now showing bruises that darkened from purple to black, proof of the struggle that almost ended with her corpse dumped in the bush, where Aboriginal justice could be blamed for British crimes. And the question nobody wanted to voice spread through the settlement like fever. How many times could one woman kill before she stopped being human and became something else entirely? A force of nature, inevitable as fire, impossible to extinguish without destroying everything around her? The answer waited in the shadows, patient as poison, ready to reveal itself when the colony least expected, mercy or justice or anything resembling either. Governor Phillip's physicians examined Wade's body while his blood turned the color of old rust. Poison again, but this time the victim had lived long enough to name his attacker. The medical tent stank of carbolic acid and decay. Canvas walls, doing nothing to contain the smell of organs shutting down in sequence. Dr. White bent over Wade's corpse with instruments that gleamed in lamplight, cataloging symptoms that told a story any apothecary could read. Liver failure, kidney collapse, the systematic shutdown that came from ingesting something nature designed to kill. Outside, 20 Marines stood in loose formation, their anger barely contained by the thin membrane of military discipline. "She can't keep doing this," Lieutenant Clark said to Captain Tench, his voice low but carrying enough edge to cut. "Wade and Fletcher tried to kill her, yes, but she's turned this settlement into her personal hunting ground. Where does it end?" Tench had no answer that satisfied anyone, including himself. The political mathematics had shifted again. One burning could be explained away as tragic accident. 2 poisonings and an assault suggested pattern, intention. A woman who discovered that violence worked and couldn't or wouldn't stop using it. The Aboriginal people were watching to see if the British would finally retaliate. The convicts were watching to see if authority meant anything in this upside-down world. And the Marines were watching their friends die, while the killer ground seeds by the creek as if corpses were just another crop. From Dr. White's autopsy report, April 22, 1791, subject expired from acute hepatic failure consistent with plant-based toxin. Victim reported consuming water from creek near Aboriginal camp. No other Marines affected, suggesting targeted poisoning rather than contaminated water source. But here was the trap Philip couldn't escape. Marinya hadn't hunted Wade. He'd hunted her. Fletcher's broken testimony, spoken in fragments, before his brain injury stole language, entirely confirmed they'd gone looking for revenge, planning to stage an accident that would satisfy their desire for justice while letting the governor maintain his diplomatic fiction. She defended herself with the same botanical knowledge she'd used to kill 42 men, and now British law had to decide if self-defense justified poisoning someone hours after the physical confrontation ended. The legal precedent was murky at best. Aboriginal people existed in a strange jurisdictional void, not quite British subjects, not quite foreign nationals, not quite human by the standards that mattered in court. Could you charge someone with murder if you didn't legally recognize them as capable of criminal intent? Could you execute someone for killing in self-defense when your own soldiers had initiated the violence? Philip called a council meeting that evening in his office, while moths battered themselves against window glass trying to reach the lamp flame inside. Present were Tench, Clark, White, Dawes, and 3 senior officers whose opinions mattered more for politics than wisdom. The conversation moved in circles: justice versus pragmatism, punishment versus peace, the letter of law versus the reality of survival. "We arrest her," Clark argued. "Public trial, public execution. Show both the natives and our own people that British law applies equally." "British law applies equally?" Dawes laughed without humor. "Which part? The part where Morrison raped her and we did nothing? The part where her sisters were enslaved and we called it service? Or the part where 2 Marines tried to murder her in the bush and were angry she survived?" The room fell silent, because truth has a way of ending arguments even when no one wants to concede the point. What would you choose, order maintained through hypocrisy or chaos that arrives wearing honesty's face? Philip made his decision at 9:30 that evening, and it satisfied absolutely no one. Marinya would be exiled from Sydney Cove, forbidden from approaching within 2 miles of the settlement. She could live with her people inland, maintain her freedom, keep her life, but her presence had become too dangerous, her history too poisonous, her very existence a reminder of everything the colony wanted to forget about how it treated the people whose land it occupied. "It's mercy," Philip said when Clark objected. "It's cowardice," Clark replied. Both were right. Bennelong delivered the news the next morning, finding Marinya at her grinding stones where she seemed to have taken permanent residence. She listened without expression, while he explained in their language that she was being banished, that soldiers would enforce the boundary, that crossing it meant immediate arrest and probable execution. "They're giving you your life," Bennelong finished. "They're taking what's left of it," she corrected. "The creek where I grind seeds, the mud flats where my sisters fished, the grave where my son lies buried, all forbidden now. They've made me homeless in my own country. Better homeless than dead." "Are you certain those are different things?" She had a point that Bennelong couldn't refute. The Eora belonged to specific country, particular stretches of coastline, particular fishing grounds, particular sacred sites where ancestors dwelled and ceremonies happened. Exile wasn't just geographic displacement. It was spiritual amputation, cutting her off from the land that defined her identity. She'd become a ghost, walking through territories where she'd never fully belong, accepted by neither her own people's laws nor the British justice that had pushed her beyond its borders. That afternoon, Marinya gathered the few possessions that mattered: grinding stones, digging stick, a shell blade her mother had made, the small bundle of seeds she'd been grinding for weeks, despite having no one to feed. She walked north along the harbor's edge, while Marines watched from a distance, ensuring she left but not assisting, not acknowledging, treating her departure like a natural process requiring no human intervention. The Aboriginal people who'd sheltered her in the camp didn't say goodbye. Goodbyes required hope for future reunion, and everyone understood this was permanent. She'd crossed too many boundaries: cultural, legal, moral. Some stains don't wash off, and some exiles can't be undone because they're written into your bones rather than mapped onto geography. She stopped once, looking back at the settlement from a ridge half a mile distant. Smoke still rose from cooking fires. Hammers still pounded on the new barracks. Convicts still labored under the lash, while Marines stood guard and officers pretended civilization had taken root in this rocky soil. From this distance, you couldn't see the graves, or smell the ash, or hear the screams that echoed only in memory. From that ridge, Sydney Cove looked almost peaceful. She turned inland and didn't look back again. But exile and invisibility aren't the same thing, and the story that began with fire would end with something far stranger. A transformation that would turn Marinya from woman into legend, from person into parable, from someone who'd killed in rage and grief into something the colony could barely comprehend and definitely couldn't control. The real horror was just beginning, and it would take forms nobody anticipated, because nobody understood that when you push someone beyond every boundary, moral, legal, geographic, spiritual, they don't disappear. They become something else entirely, and that something else rarely asks permission before returning to settle accounts. 3 months passed before anyone from Sydney Cove saw Marinya again, and when they did, she'd transformed into something they didn't recognize. The sighting came from a timber-cutting crew working the northern forests in late July 1791. Convict John Matthews reported it to his overseer with the nervous energy of someone who'd seen something impossible but couldn't unsee it. The forest there grew dense, with blue gums and stringy bark, the canopy so thick that midday felt like twilight. Water dripped constantly from leaves, even when it hadn't rained, creating a perpetual mist that turned sound strange and distance deceptive. Matthews had been hauling logs when he'd glimpsed movement, a woman painted entirely in white clay, moving through the trees with a silence that suggested either supernatural skill or supernatural origin. Was it her? The overseer asked, though he already knew the answer. Had to be. Same height, same build, but the clay covered head to foot like a ghost. She looked straight at me, and I swear she smiled. The white clay wasn't decoration or camouflage. It was declaration. The Eora painted themselves with sacred ochres and clays for specific ceremonies, for mourning, for initiation into new states of being. White clay, applied fully, traditionally marked someone undergoing death and rebirth, someone transitioning between worlds. Marinya had covered herself in the color of ghosts and smoke, announcing that the woman who'd ground seeds by the creek no longer existed. From Missionary Records 1808, the natives speak of a spirit woman who walks between the living and dead. They claim she cannot be harmed by ordinary weapons, that she drinks poison like water, that she's already died, and therefore cannot die again. The sightings multiplied through winter and into spring. A shepherd near Parramatta saw her watching his flock from a ridgeline, motionless as stone, her white-painted face visible even at 100 yards. A fishing boat crew spotted her on the harbor's northern shore at dawn, wading into water up to her waist and standing there as if testing whether the sea would claim her. Convicts working chain gangs reported glimpses always distant, always silent, a pale figure that appeared and vanished, like morning fog burning off. She never approached the settlement, never crossed the 2-mile boundary, never gave authorities justification for arrest or violence. But her presence haunted Sydney Cove more effectively than any physical proximity could have achieved. The message was clear. Exile had failed to eliminate her, and invisibility was a choice she could revoke whenever it suited her purposes. Lieutenant Dawes, who'd continued studying Aboriginal culture despite his military duties, understood what others missed. "She's performing a ceremony," he explained to Governor Phillip during one of their evening discussions. Among the Eora, when someone commits an act that violates tribal law, they sometimes undergo a ritual death, a period of isolation and transformation, meant to cleanse the spiritual contamination. And after the cleansing, Philip asked, they return, different name, different status, but integrated back into the community. Dawes paused, or they don't return at all. Sometimes the ritual death becomes permanent. Which path was Marinya walking toward reintegration or toward actual death? Nobody could say, and perhaps she didn't know herself. The grief that had driven her to burn 42 men hadn't disappeared with exile. The guilt of killing her own child hadn't lessened with distance. She carried all of it, rage and remorse, justification and shame, in a body that moved through the world but no longer belonged to it. What would you become if you'd lost everything, avenged everything, and destroyed the one piece of future you'd tried to protect? The Aboriginal people who encountered her inland told stories that Bennelong later translated, though he warned that translation always simplified truth. She joined a group near the Hawkesbury River for a time, participating in ceremonies but never quite integrating. She moved like someone sleepwalking through rituals that had lost their power to bind or heal. When they tried to wash away the white clay, the proper conclusion to the mourning ceremony, she'd refused, reapplying it each morning, as if the ritual death had become her permanent condition. The elders didn't know what to do with her. She'd violated laws about kinship and bloodshed in ways their justice system couldn't address. The British had violated her in ways their justice system wouldn't address. She existed in the gap between two legal frameworks, belonging to neither, judged by both, granted mercy by none. By October 1791, the sightings had taken on a pattern. She appeared most frequently near places where Aboriginal people had died in conflicts with settlers, a creek where 2 men had been shot for spearing sheep, a clearing where a woman had been flogged for stealing bread, a cave where children had succumbed to European diseases their bodies couldn't fight. She was mapping grief, creating a geography of colonial violence that existed parallel to the official maps showing farms and boundaries and property claims. One night, she appeared at the edge of Sydney Cove itself, not quite crossing the boundary, but close enough that sentries could see her white-painted figure standing motionless on the ridge where Bennelong had watched the barracks burn 6 months earlier. She stood there from midnight until dawn, visible in moonlight, a reminder that exile was geography, but haunting was eternal. The Marines who watched her through that long night reported feeling something they couldn't articulate. Not quite fear, not quite guilt, something that made their hands shake and their dreams turn dark for weeks afterward. Private Anderson claimed she'd been crying, though from 100 yards in moonlight, he couldn't possibly have confirmed tears on a clay-covered face. Private Cooper insisted she'd been laughing, a sound that carried across water and made his skin crawl. Both were probably wrong, but both were responding to the same truth. Marinya had stopped performing emotions for observers. Whatever she felt happened internally now, invisible beneath white clay and practiced stillness. She'd become what exile and grief together created, a living memorial to violence that nobody wanted to remember, but everyone could feel pressing against their consciousness like a thumb against a bruise. Governor Phillip considered sending a delegation to speak with her. To offer what? Reconciliation? Apology? Permission to return under conditions that would satisfy no one? He drafted 3 different letters and burned them all, recognizing that some conversations couldn't happen because the language for them didn't exist in either English or Eora. You couldn't negotiate with someone who'd moved beyond negotiation, who discovered that justice and vengeance were words people used to avoid admitting they wanted the same thing. Balance restored through blood. The winter of 1791 was particularly harsh. Ships arrived with supplies barely adequate for the colony's needs. Scurvy weakened the convict workforce. Aboriginal resistance to settlement increased as Europeans pushed farther inland, disrupting fishing grounds and hunting territories. And through it all, Marinya haunted the boundaries like a conscience the colony wished it could ignore. She was preparing for something that much was obvious to anyone paying attention. The sightings were reconnaissance, mapping not just geography, but patterns of movement, timing of patrols, locations of vulnerabilities. She'd burned the barracks when burning was the weapon available. Now, painted white as death itself, she was learning the settlement's new rhythms, waiting for the moment when whatever came next could be delivered with maximum impact. The question haunting the colony's quiet moments was simple. What does a woman who's already lost everything and killed everyone still want? The answer would come in November, delivered not with fire this time, but with something far more terrifying. Absolute silence that would force Sydney Cove to confront exactly what it had created, when it gave Marinya every reason to become a weapon, and no reason to ever stop being one. On November 3rd, 1791, every Aboriginal person within 5 miles of Sydney Cove vanished simultaneously. The fishermen didn't arrive at dawn. The traders didn't bring game. The children who'd watched Convict work gangs stopped appearing. The settlement woke to absence so complete it felt like pressure in the ears, like diving underwater where sound changes quality and direction becomes uncertain. The bark canoes that usually dotted the harbor sat empty on beaches. The fires that typically sent smoke signals across the ridges remained unlit. The paths through the bush showed no fresh footprints, no signs of movement, no evidence that thousands of people who'd lived here for millennia had existed at all. Lieutenant Clark organized search parties by mid-morning, more confused than alarmed. 6 groups of 4 Marines each fanned out in different directions, checking the usual camping spots, the fishing grounds, the sacred sites that Aboriginal people had cautiously allowed Europeans to learn about. They found nothing, not bodies, not tracks, not even the debris of hasty departure. The Aboriginal population had evaporated like morning dew, leaving behind only empty spaces where human presence should have been. "It's her," Captain Tench said to Governor Phillip at noon. "She's organized this somehow." Organized what exactly? Phillip stood at his window, staring at harbor waters disturbed only by European boats. An entire people don't simply disappear because one woman suggests it, don't they? We exiled her, and now her people have exiled us. Removed themselves so completely that we're forced to confront exactly how dependent we've become on their knowledge, their labor, their tolerance of our presence. The truth of it settled over the settlement. Like ash, the Aboriginal people had been teaching colonists which plants were edible, which water sources were safe, where fish schooled seasonally, how to read weather patterns in this upside-down hemisphere. They'd been trading game for tools, demonstrating fire management techniques, serving as guides through terrain that killed Europeans who ventured unprepared. Their absence wasn't just symbolic, it was immediately, practically dangerous. From the colony's provision records, November 4th, 1791, fresh fish supplies, nil. Game provisions, nil. Native guides for interior exploration, unavailable. Estimated time before food shortage becomes critical, 3 weeks. The convicts noticed first, because they always noticed when something affected their survival. The Marines had been supplementing official rations with fish and kangaroo meat obtained through Aboriginal trade networks. Without those sources, everyone would be living on hardtack and salt pork that was already running low after a particularly difficult supply year. The settlement's gardens weren't mature enough to sustain 200 people through summer. Hunting parties without Aboriginal guides got lost or came back empty-handed, unfamiliar with the movements and patterns of animals that had no European equivalents. By the third day, panic began replacing confusion. Search parties ranged farther, finding campsites that had been methodically cleaned, every tool removed, every fire pit covered, every sign of habitation erased as if the earth itself had swallowed the evidence. One party found a single object left behind: a grinding stone placed deliberately in the center of a cleared area, positioned where it couldn't be missed. The stone showed fresh use, grain dust still clinging to its surface, Marinya's signature, subtle as poison. What would you feel, waking up to discover that the people you'd oppressed had simply withdrawn their presence, leaving you to survive or fail on your own merits? Bennelong reappeared on the 5th day, walking into the settlement alone just before sunset. He looked thinner, exhausted, as if he'd traveled a great distance without rest. Governor Philip received him immediately, desperate for explanation or negotiation, or any information that might end the increasingly desperate situation. "Where are they?" Philip asked without preamble. "Inland, beyond the mountains." Bennelong accepted the rum Philip offered, drank it in one swallow. "They're holding council, deciding whether to return or stay gone permanently. This is Marinya's doing. This is your doing. Hers. Ours. Everyone's." Bennelong poured himself another drink, without asking permission. She walked into the gathering 2 weeks ago, still painted white, still carrying her grief like a second skin. She didn't speak at first, just sat and listened while the elders debated what to do about the settlement, about the violence, about the future. Then she said 6 words that changed everything. Philip waited, barely breathing. She said, "We don't need them. They need us." The simplicity of it was devastating. For 6 months, the colony had been treating the Aboriginal population as a problem to be managed, a threat to be contained, obstacles to settlement that required removal or subjugation. Marinya had revealed the opposite truth. The settlers were the dependent party, parasites who'd arrived with inadequate knowledge and survived only through Aboriginal tolerance and assistance. "What do they want?" Philip asked. "They want you to understand what you've taken. They want you to feel what exile means, to be cut off from everything that sustains you, to be foreign in a place that should be home, to be at the mercy of forces that owe you nothing." Bennelong set down his cup. "They want you to experience 1 week of what Marinya has experienced for 6 months. And after the week, that depends on what you learn." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything nobody wanted to say. The colony couldn't survive long-term without Aboriginal cooperation. The British couldn't simply conquer through force because the Aboriginal people could fade into terrain that Europeans barely understood. This wasn't a war that could be won with muskets and discipline. This was a war of attrition, and the side that actually belonged to the land had every advantage that mattered. Governor Philip made several decisions in the next hour. He ordered all Marines to remain within the settlement boundaries, no more patrols into Aboriginal territory, no more attempts to track or locate the missing population. He drafted a letter that Bennelong would carry back to the council, acknowledging that the colony had committed wrongs and expressing willingness to negotiate new terms of coexistence. He reduced convict work details to essential tasks only, conserving energy as food supplies dwindled. And he wrote a separate letter to London, marked confidential, explaining that the colonial project was failing because it had never properly accounted for the humanity and agency of the people whose land they were occupying. That letter would take 18 months to arrive, and another 18 for a response. By then, everything would be different anyway. On the 7th day, Aboriginal people began returning. Not all at once, not with fanfare, just gradually reappearing like tide coming back to shore. The fishermen returned to their usual spots. The traders brought kangaroo meat. The children resumed their curious observation of convict life. But something fundamental had shifted. The power dynamic everyone had pretended didn't exist was now visible and undeniable. Marinya didn't return. She stayed inland, beyond the mountains, her white-painted figure occasionally spotted by travelers, but never approached, never spoken to, never integrated back into either Aboriginal or colonial society. She'd become permanent exile, permanent reminder, permanent ghost haunting the boundaries between worlds. Bennelong told Philip one final detail during their last meeting about the incident. When Marinya had convinced the Aboriginal people to withdraw, she'd said something else, something the elders hadn't fully understood, but had felt the truth of anyway. She'd said, "They killed my sisters, so I killed their brothers. They burned my future, so I burned their present. Now let them taste what absence feels like, and maybe they'll finally understand that some things, once destroyed, can never be restored." The settlement had survived the week of silence, but barely. More importantly, it had learned what Marinya had always known, that power isn't just about weapons or authority or the ability to inflict violence. Sometimes, power is simply the choice to withdraw, to absent yourself from systems that require your presence, to say no so completely that yes becomes the only word that matters. The barracks had been rebuilt stronger after the fire. The colony's defenses had been reinforced after the poisonings. But no defense existed against absence, against silence, against an entire people choosing to simply disappear and let the colonizers face the consequences of their own inadequacy. Marinya had taught them that lesson using nothing more than patience, persuasion, and the white clay that marked her as already dead and therefore impossible to kill again. But the final lesson was still coming, and it would arrive wearing a face nobody expected. 18 years later, a young woman named Sarah Morrison walked into Sydney's government house carrying a letter written in 2 languages. She'd been raised by missionaries, educated in English, but her face told a different story. The anteroom smelled of beeswax and authority, polished wood reflecting the faces of men who'd built careers, administering a colony that had survived its turbulent birth. Governor Macquarie Phillips' successor, twice removed, received visitors on Thursdays, hearing petitions and complaints from subjects who believed government might solve problems that usually just required patience or money. Sarah Morrison had neither, but she had something more dangerous, a story that connected the colony's founding violence to its present prosperity. She was 24 years old, mixed blood, European father, Aboriginal mother, with features that suggested both worlds without fully belonging to either. The missionaries had found her as a child, wandering near Parramatta, speaking neither English nor any Aboriginal language they recognized. She'd learned both eventually, along with reading and writing, and Christian doctrine that sat uneasily with memories that refused to be baptized away. From Sarah Morrison's petition, November 15, 1809, I request information regarding my parentage. I was found in 1801, approximately 6 years of age, near the burned remains of a camp north of the Hawkesbury River. A woman, matching the description of the notorious Marinya, was reported in the area. I believe she was my mother. Macquarie read the petition, while Sarah stood motionless, her posture suggesting someone who'd learned stillness as survival strategy. The name Marinya meant nothing to him. Initially, he'd arrived in the colony years after the barracks burning, after the poisonings, after the week of silence that old-timers still discussed in lowered voices. But his secretary recognized it immediately, disappearing into the archives and returning with files that told a story Macquarie hadn't known his colony possessed. The woman who burned the barracks, the secretary explained quietly, killed over 40 men. They exiled her in 1791. No confirmed sightings after 1801. Macquarie studied Sarah with new attention. You believe you're her daughter? I know I am. I have memories, fragments. A woman painted white who sang songs in a language I've forgotten. Fires that we moved between, never staying anywhere long. And this. She produced a grinding stone from her bag, worn smooth by decades of use. I was holding it when the missionaries found me. It has her name carved underneath, not Marinya, but her true name, Adalanga. It means the one who grinds. The stone passed between them, heavy with more than physical weight. Macquarie turned it over, finding the carved symbols that predated European writing systems, that spoke to traditions his colony was systematically destroying. He didn't know what to do with this information. This woman, this living connection to violence that official records had tried to classify as tragedy or accident or justified response to native aggression. What do you want from me? He asked finally. I want to know what happened. The missionaries tell one story, the savage who murdered innocent men. The Aboriginal people tell another, the woman who fought back against those who destroyed her family. I want the truth that lives between those versions. What truth could satisfy someone whose existence proved that violence produces consequences that outlive the original sins? Over the next 3 hours, Macquarie's secretary assembled what records existed. The barracks fire, the poisonings, the exile, the week of silence, testimonies from Benelong, now dead, letters from Lieutenant Dawes, who'd returned to England, medical reports from Dr. White, who documented everything, and one final document, a notation from 1801 reporting that a white-painted Aboriginal woman had been found dead near the Hawkesbury River, her body positioned deliberately near a campfire that had burned down to coals. A child, approximately 5 years old, discovered alive nearby. They thought you were Aboriginal, the secretary explained. Full blood. Took you to the missionaries who handled such cases. Didn't realize until later that you were mixed heritage. And by then you'd been baptized, Sarah, given the surname Morrison because... He stopped. Checked the records. Because the missionary who named you had known Captain Morrison. Thought it was fitting that his surname should survive through a child, even if not his own. The irony was thick enough to choke on. Sarah Morrison, daughter of the woman who'd killed Captain Morrison, carrying his name through history like a trophy or a curse, or simply a cosmic joke that nobody found funny. Sarah read through the documents with expressions that cycled through shock, recognition, grief, and something harder to classify. When she finally looked up, her eyes held the same distance that old-timers remembered from Marinya's gaze, the look of someone who'd seen too much to ever fully return to innocence. She kept me alive for 10 years, Sarah said quietly, living as an exile, painted white, carrying me between camps, where neither of us fully belonged. Then she died by that fire, positioning me where I'd be found, choosing to end her life only after ensuring I'd survive in the world she'd tried to burn down. We don't know that she chose. She chose everything. The burning, the poisonings, the exile, her death, and my survival. Sarah closed the files with finality. She taught me one thing before the language went away, before the memories faded. She taught me that some fires never fully extinguish. They just move underground, smoldering, waiting for oxygen. Macquarie felt suddenly uncomfortable, as if this young woman contained multitudes he wasn't prepared to confront. What will you do with this information? Remember it. Pass it down. Make sure the story survives beyond the official records that tried to classify her as monster or victim, but never as both. Never as human. Sarah stood, gathering her documents. You're building a colony on land you took and stories you buried. I'm going to unbury them, one truth at a time, until people understand that everything here is built on ashes that still hold heat. She left Government House carrying the grinding stone and copies of documents that Macquarie's secretary shouldn't have provided, but did anyway, recognizing that some debts transcend regulation. Sarah Morrison would spend the next 40 years collecting stories from Aboriginal elders, from old convicts, from anyone who remembered the early years when Sydney Cove had nearly failed, because one woman decided that justice mattered more than survival. She never married, never had children, never found the belonging that might have eased the isolation of living between worlds. But she created something more enduring, a written record that preserved what official histories wanted to forget. Her manuscript, The Smoke That Never Cleared, Aboriginal Resistance in Early Sydney, wouldn't be published until 1873, decades after her death. And even then, only in limited circulation, because the truths it contained made too many powerful families uncomfortable. But the story survived anyway, passed mouth to ear, grandmother to grandchild, becoming the shadow history that runs parallel to official narratives. They say Marinya's spirit still walks the boundaries between settlement and wilderness, still painted white, still carrying grief that transcends death. They say her grinding stone, the real one, not the copy Sarah carried, appears in different locations, always near sites where Aboriginal people suffered under colonial rule, always positioned where it can't be missed. They say some fires never fully extinguish. They just change form, moving from wood to flesh to memory to legend, burning through generations until everyone involved is ash. But the heat remains, impossible to ignore, impossible to forget. And even now, in modern Sydney, built over the bones of that early settlement, people sometimes smell smoke where no fire burns, taste ash where no flame exists, and feel the presence of a woman who discovered that the only power remaining to the powerless is the power to refuse submission, to refuse silence, to refuse dying on anyone's terms but your own. The barracks she burned are buried under office buildings. The creek where she ground seeds runs through culverts beneath highways. But this story persists, because some truths are more durable than stone, more persistent than memory, more patient than revenge. Marinya became smoke, and smoke gets everywhere eventually. The archaeologists found the grinding stone in 2023, buried beneath what used to be the tank stream. Carbon dating placed it at late 18th century, and the worn surface told stories that DNA analysis would later confirm. The excavation site hummed with the sound of generators and sifting screens. Modern technology applied to ancient soil in Sydney's Rocks district, where developers had planned luxury apartments until ground-penetrating radar revealed artifacts that triggered heritage protection laws. The team worked carefully through layers of history, 19th century sewerage systems, convict-era foundations, and, beneath it all, the original settlement's footprint, where Marinya had once ground seeds while planning murder. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, lead archaeologist, held the stone under examination lights, while her team documented its position, its context, its relationship to surrounding artifacts. The carving underneath was unmistakable. Adalanga, the name that meant the one who grinds, preserved in stone that had survived 2 centuries of urban development, flooding, and deliberate attempts to erase anything that contradicted the official narrative of peaceful settlement. "We found something else," her assistant said, pointing to a sealed clay vessel positioned deliberately beside the stone. Inside, wrapped in bark that had somehow survived, were seeds. Dozens of them, carefully stored, representing species both food crops and poisonous plants. a botanical library encoded in organic matter, teaching and warning in equal measure. The DNA testing revealed multiple contributors, Marinya's genetic signature on the stone's surface, mixed with traces from at least 15 other individuals who'd used it over decades. But more significantly, analysis of the seeds showed cultivation patterns that contradicted everything historians thought they knew about Aboriginal agricultural practices. These weren't wild-gathered plants. They were selectively bred, carefully preserved, representing generations of botanical knowledge that Europeans had dismissed as primitive foraging. From Dr. Chen's preliminary report, August 20th, 2023, the evidence suggests systematic agriculture predating European arrival, sophisticated understanding of plant genetics, and deliberate preservation of both nutritional and medicinal species. Subject: Marinya appears to have been not just a cook, but a botanical expert whose knowledge would have been valuable beyond measure if anyone had bothered to recognize it. The discovery triggered a cascade of historical reevaluation. Sarah Morrison's unpublished manuscript was retrieved from archives and finally published in full. Her documentation of Aboriginal resistance and colonial violence, providing context that official records had deliberately obscured. Descendants of both Aboriginal and European colonial families found themselves confronting histories more complex than the simple narratives they'd inherited. Marinya's story stopped being a footnote about a vengeful native and became something more troubling, a case study in what happens when systematic oppression meets systematic resistance, when rape produces children who carry both victim and perpetrator's blood, when justice exists only in the space that violence carves out because no legal framework will accommodate it. The grinding stone went on display at the Australian Museum with full historical context: the abductions, the sexual violence, the barracks burning, the poisonings, the exile, and the child who survived, to ensure the story persisted. School groups stood before it, teachers explaining that history isn't simple, that heroes and villains rarely exist in pure forms, that the same person can be both victim and perpetrator depending on which moment you're examining. Some visitors were appalled. How could the museum honor a mass murderer? Others argued it wasn't honoring, but documenting, preserving truth even when truth was uncomfortable. The debate raged in newspapers and social media, revealing that Marinya's fire still generated heat 2 centuries later, still divided people into camps based on whether they believed some violence was justified by preceding violence, or whether civilization meant breaking those cycles, regardless of cost. But here's what the grinding stone actually proved. Beyond the arguments and debates, Marinya had existed, not as symbol or legend or cautionary tale, but as a real woman with specific skills who'd made specific choices in response to specific horrors. The stone bore her name, her DNA, her daily labor. She'd ground seeds there while her sisters were enslaved, while her child grew inside her from rape, while she calculated exactly how much nightshade would kill 42 men, but spare their children if she chose mercy over absolute revenge. She'd been human, horrifyingly, beautifully, impossibly human. And that humanity persisted in stone and seed and story, long after the barracks she'd burned had been rebuilt and destroyed and paved over and forgotten by everyone except those who needed to remember. The Aboriginal community held a ceremony at the excavation site in October 2023. They sang songs in languages that were being reclaimed after generations of suppression, burned eucalyptus leaves so smoke could carry prayers to ancestors, and acknowledged Marinya not as hero or villain, but as one of their own, who'd done what she'd done, who'd carried consequences until they killed her, who'd ensured her daughter survived, even though survival meant living between worlds without fully belonging to either. Dr. Chen stood at the edges of the ceremony, watching smoke rise over modern Sydney, and understood something that her academic training hadn't prepared her for. Some stories aren't meant to be solved or concluded. or neatly categorized. Some stories are meant to persist as open wounds, as questions that each generation answers differently, as fires that never fully extinguish because the fuel injustice, violence, unresolved grief keeps regenerating. Marinya's grinding stone would outlast everyone currently alive. The seeds she'd preserved might someday be planted again by descendants who'd reclaim botanical knowledge their ancestors had carried. And the story, the full story, not the sanitized version or the demonized version, but the complicated truth about a woman who'd been victimized and became victimizer, who'd lost everything and destroyed everything, who'd chosen her own death only after ensuring her child would survive, to remember that story would keep being told and retold, each version revealing more about the teller than the subject, because that's what history does. It grinds truth like seeds, crushing and separating and processing until what remains is both more and less than the original concentrated essence and fragments simultaneously, nourishment and poison, depending on dosage and intent. The archaeologists reburied the site after documentation, covering the grinding stone and seeds with protective layers before developers built their luxury apartments on top. But replicas were created, distributed to museums and cultural centers and schools, where new generations could touch the same surface Marinya's hands had touched, could feel the grooves her daily labor had worn into stone, could contemplate what it means to be human in situations where humanity itself becomes a liability. And late at night, when Sydney streets empty and modern noise fades, people who live in those luxury apartments sometimes report smelling smoke where no fire burns, hearing grinding sounds from beneath foundations, feeling presences that architecture can't eliminate because some occupants refuse to be displaced even by death and 2 centuries of urban development. They say Marinya still grinds seeds in the spaces between then and now, preparing meals that nourish or poison, depending on what you bring to the table, what hunger you're trying to satisfy, what justice you're willing to acknowledge when it arrives, wearing a face you don't want to recognize as human, because recognizing humanity means admitting complicity in what drove someone to choose fire and poison and exile over. Submission. The grinding stone endures. The seeds wait. The story persists. And somewhere in the smoke that never fully clears, a woman painted white continues her labor, patient as stone, inevitable as memory, teaching anyone willing to learn that some debts transcend generations. Some fires burn underground until conditions allow them to surface, and some truths can only be ground fine enough to swallow after centuries of processing. Sydney built a city over her ashes, but ashes make excellent fertilizer, and what grows in that soil carries genetic memory of everything that came before the violence, the resistance, the survival, the transformation of one woman's grief into a nation's haunted conscience. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.